So the big question is why? Why would we be prone to these kinds of things? And there's a pretty reasonable answer. It's that we're not that smart. And I say that, of course, with a little bit tongue-in-cheek, because, of course, we're actually amazingly smart. But the truth is that the human brain and what we can do with it is limited. There is far too much information in the world for us to process. We can't pay attention to everything. We don't have the opportunity to think things through. We are subject to making decisions and processing perceptions based on incomplete information with insufficient time. And we have our own issues of irrationality to deal with. We may find certain realities difficult to bear emotionally, and so we'll have an unconscious bias skewing how we perceive what's happening, even to provide us with some sense of emotional safety. So there's a lot contributing to why we have to process so many things unconsciously and just react. If we didn't, we wouldn't make it out of the apartment in the morning. But the point is that as we understand that sort of bigger picture, we can then start to break it down into behaviors and processes that are actually a little bit more predictable. And this is what's going to end up being very important to us, is that irrational does not mean the same thing as unpredictable. In fact, irrationality can be quite predictable. There are all sorts of situations where we can reproduce the same kind of irrationality and therefore make the conclusion that these various contributing circumstances are what lead to this kinds of behavior. And in breaking that down into smaller components, there's two really big concepts that drive a lot of behavioral economics. They're called heuristics and biases. Now, heuristics are quite literally mental shortcuts. These are things that we do, they are coping mechanisms to help us live in the world. So we do things like we will overestimate the probability of an event based on how fresh it is in our minds. So, for example, after Hurricane Katrina, we all would have rated the likelihood and probability of a devastating flood as much higher a week and a half after it happened than we would today. And that's because the images of Hurricane Katrina would have been so fresh in our minds. And so that availability to that mental picture is having a huge impact on how we perceive the likelihood of that kind of thing happening. I'm not going to go through all of the different heuristics. Part of my job is knowing where cognitive load stands, which means that when we try to overwhelm people with too much information, they lose it all. So I'm going to leave it at that. What I will say, though, is that if you find this stuff interesting, at the end of the presentation, I'm going to go through a couple of books that you might find really interesting, where you can learn everything that you possibly would want to about this subject.